My name is Lila Green, and I'm 28 years old. Life hasn't always been kind to me, especially after my father remarried. My stepmom, Margaret, has never hidden the fact that she sees me as a burden rather than family. She dotes on her son, Ethan, who is my stepbrother, while I've always been treated like an outsider. The tension between us reached new heights when I received the invitation to Ethan's wedding. The envelope was made of fancy, gold-embossed paper, and the invitation inside was written in elegant script. At first glance, it seemed like a gesture of inclusion, but I quickly realized the truth. Margaret hadn't invited me because she cared. No, she invited me because it would look bad if Ethan's sister wasn't there. I stared at the invitation for a long time, debating whether to attend. My husband, Jonathan, encouraged me to go. He said it would be a chance to rise above the pettiness and show them I wasn't as insignificant as they thought. "You don't need their approval, Lila," he said, his voice calm and steady as always. "But sometimes showing up is the best way to remind people of your worth." Jonathan had always been my rock. At 35 years old, he was not just my husband but also a successful CEO of a major corporation. The funny thing was, Margaret didn't know who he was. She'd never asked about my life or even cared enough to know who I married. The wedding day arrived, and I chose a simple but elegant navy blue dress. It wasn't flashy or expensive, but it made me feel confident. As I stood in front of the mirror, Jonathan came up behind me and placed his hands gently on my shoulders. "You look beautiful," he said, his smile warm. "Let's show them the real you today." Taking a deep breath, I nodded. It was time to face Margaret and whatever insults she had prepared for me. When we arrived at the wedding venue, my heart sank a little. The place was absolutely stunning, a sprawling estate with crystal chandeliers and perfectly manicured gardens. It screamed wealth and luxury, the kind of event where Margaret thrived. The moment I walked through the door, I could feel the weight of her judgmental eyes on me. Margaret was dressed in an extravagant silver gown, her jewelry sparkling under the soft lights. She approached me with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Lila," she said, her tone dripping with mock politeness. "I wasn't sure if you'd show up. This is such a high-class event after all. I hope you didn't feel out of place." I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a polite smile. "Thank you for inviting me. It's a beautiful wedding." Margaret tilted her head, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. "Well, I suppose it's good for Ethan to have all the family here, even if some of us don't quite belong." Her words stung, but I held my ground. I wasn't going to let her see me break. Little did she know, the tables were about to turn. My husband, Jonathan, was on his way, and Margaret was in for a surprise she would never forget. Margaret's words were still ringing in my ears as I moved toward the seating area. The wedding venue was breathtaking, filled with extravagant floral arrangements, glittering chandeliers, and a live string quartet. It was everything Margaret would want, a display of wealth and class. I tried to focus on the event, but it wasn't easy with Margaret lurking around, making sure everyone knew she was the perfect hostess. Her sharp glances in my direction were like tiny daggers. "Lila." A voice pulled me out of my thoughts. It was Ethan, my stepbrother. Dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, he looked every bit the groom. His smile was polite but distant, the same way it had always been between us. "I'm glad you could make it," he said, though his tone lacked any real warmth. "Of course. I wouldn't miss my brother's wedding," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Ethan nodded and quickly excused himself, clearly more interested in mingling with his wealthy friends than catching up with me. I found a seat near the back of the room, away from the spotlight. The ceremony began shortly after, and despite my mixed feelings, I couldn't deny that it was beautiful. Ethan's bride, Sophia, looked radiant in her flowing white gown. But even as the vows were exchanged and applause filled the air, I felt like I didn't belong. Margaret's words had done their job, leaving me questioning why I had even come. And then, just as the reception began, everything changed. Jonathan arrived. He stepped into the room with the quiet confidence that always turned heads. At 6 feet 2 inches, with broad shoulders and a sharp suit tailored to perfection, he looked like he belonged in a magazine. But it wasn't just his looks. Jonathan carried himself with an air of authority that made people take notice. Margaret was mid-laugh when her eyes landed on him. Her expression froze, and for a moment, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Who? Who is that? I heard her whisper to one of her friends. Jonathan spotted me instantly and made his way over, his smile warm and genuine. He bent down slightly to kiss my cheek. "Sorry I'm late, love. I had to finish a last-minute call," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "You're just in time," I replied, feeling a surge of confidence with him by my side. Margaret, however, was not so composed. She walked over, her forced smile barely hiding her confusion. "Lila," she began, her tone overly sweet. "And who is this?" "This is my husband," I said, meeting her gaze head-on. "Jonathan Green." Her eyes widened. "Jonathan Green?" she repeated, her voice faltering. "Yes," Jonathan said, extending his hand. "CEO of Green Enterprises. It's nice to meet you, Margaret. Lila has told me so much about you." Margaret's face went pale. She worked at Green Enterprises, but clearly, she had never made the connection. Now, she was standing face to face with her boss. "Oh, I didn't realize," Margaret stammered, struggling to recover. Jonathan smiled politely, but didn't let her off the hook. "It's interesting to finally meet Lila's stepmother. She's mentioned how much you've supported her over the years." The sarcasm in his tone was subtle, but I caught it, and so did Margaret. Margaret's discomfort was almost palpable as she fumbled for a response. "Well, yes, of course. Family is so important." I couldn't help but smile as I watched her squirm. For the first time in years, the power dynamic had shifted, and Margaret was no longer in control. As Jonathan and I walked away to join the other guests, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This was just the beginning, and I had a feeling Margaret's world was about to unravel. The reception hall buzzed with laughter and music as Jonathan and I made our way through the crowd. His presence beside me gave me a confidence I hadn't felt in years. For once, I didn't feel like the outcast of my family. Margaret, on the other hand, was far from her usual composed self. She was clearly rattled, stealing glances at us from across the room, whispering frantically to Ethan and anyone else who would listen. Jonathan leaned down and whispered, "She looks like she's seen a ghost." I chuckled softly. She's not used to being surprised. She's spent years making me feel like I don't belong. Jonathan's expression hardened. "Not anymore." As we approached the table where Margaret sat with a group of her friends, she straightened up and forced a smile. "Jonathan," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "why don't you join us? We'd love to hear about your work." Jonathan smiled politely, but didn't sit. "I'd be happy to. After all, Green Enterprises is always looking for ways to improve its work environment. Perhaps you could tell me about your experience there?" Margaret's smile faltered. Well, everything's been wonderful." "Of course." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "That's good to hear. Though I was surprised to find discrepancies in certain department budgets recently. It's something I've been investigating closely." Margaret's face turned pale. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," she said quickly, glancing nervously at her friends. "I'm sure it is," Jonathan replied smoothly, his gaze steady. The tension at the table was almost tangible. Margaret was clearly trying to keep up appearances, but her usual confidence was cracking. Ethan approached us, his smile forced. "Hey, Jonathan, why don't we grab a drink? It's my wedding after all." Jonathan smiled, but didn't move. "Of course, Ethan. But first, I'd like to congratulate you and Sophia. Lila and I are happy to be here." Ethan's eyes darted to Margaret, then back to us. "Thanks. It means a lot." I could see the unease in both of their expressions. Margaret clearly hadn't told Ethan who Jonathan was, and now they were scrambling to adjust. Jonathan turned back to me and said, "Why don't we step outside for a moment, love? I think some fresh air would do us good." I nodded, grateful for the chance to escape the tense atmosphere. As we walked out to the garden, Jonathan's expression shifted from polite to serious.
"There's something you should know," he said.
"What is it?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. I've been investigating financial irregularities in the company for months, he said. Margaret's name has come up more than once. I wasn't entirely surprised, but it still stung. Do you think she's stealing from the company? Jonathan nodded. I have strong evidence to suggest she's been redirecting funds for personal use. I didn't want to bring it up before the wedding, but now that I've met her, I see exactly what kind of person she is. I let out a shaky breath. What are you going to do? He placed a reassuring hand on mine. Don't worry. I'll handle it. But tonight, I want you to enjoy yourself. You've spent too long letting her make you feel small. His words gave me a sense of calm. For the first time, I felt like I had someone truly on my side. When we returned to the reception, I held my head high. Margaret's smugness had been replaced by visible unease, and I couldn't help but smile. The tables had turned, and for once, I wasn't the one feeling out of place. This wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. But for now, I was content to let Margaret squirm, knowing that her actions would catch up with her soon. The rest of the evening carried on like a delicate dance of tension and elegance. Margaret did her best to avoid us, though her eyes occasionally darted in our direction. It was clear she was piecing together the consequences of Jonathan's revelations. As the speeches began, I sat quietly, trying to focus on the positive moments. Ethan stood at the center of the hall, thanking everyone for attending and singing praises for his new wife, Sophia. The crowd clapped politely, and for a brief moment, it felt like the attention was finally off me. But Margaret had other plans. During one of the toasts, she stood up, champagne glass in hand, and cleared her throat. I just want to say, she began, her voice oozing with fake warmth, how proud I am of my son, Ethan. He's always been such a wonderful example of success and loyalty. Her words felt like daggers aimed at me, carefully crafted to emphasize my supposed failures. And, of course, she continued, it's lovely to have family here today, though some of us have taken unexpected paths in life. The subtle jab hung in the air, and I felt my face heat up. Before I could respond, Jonathan placed a calming hand on my arm. Let her talk, Jonathan whispered. She's only embarrassing herself. Margaret smiled smugly, clearly pleased with her supposed triumph. But her moment of glory was short-lived. Jonathan stood up, his tall frame commanding attention. Since we're sharing toasts, I'd like to say a few words, he began, his tone calm yet firm. Margaret's face froze as Jonathan addressed the crowd. I'm incredibly proud to be here with my wife, Lila, he said, looking at me with genuine warmth. She's one of the strongest, most resilient people I know. Despite challenges, she's always carried herself with grace and dignity. The room grew silent, all eyes on Jonathan. And as the CEO of Green Enterprises, he continued, I believe in rewarding hard work and integrity. That's why it's so important to address issues when they arise. Issues like financial dishonesty. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd as people exchanged confused glances. Margaret's face turned ghostly pale. Some of you may not know, Jonathan said, his gaze settling directly on Margaret, but there have been ongoing investigations into significant financial discrepancies within my company. I won't go into details tonight, but I will say this. Justice will always prevail. Margaret's hand trembled, and the glass she held clinked against the table. Jonathan turned to me and smiled. And I'm grateful to have someone like Lila by my side, a woman who knows her worth and never lets anyone make her feel less than she is. The room erupted in applause, but Margaret sat frozen, her facade completely shattered. As the evening wound down, guests whispered about Jonathan's speech, casting judgmental glances at Margaret. The once dominant hostess was now a shadow of herself, and for the first time, I felt a sense of victory. But this was only the beginning. Margaret's secrets were unraveling, and I knew there was more to come. The applause from Jonathan's speech still echoed in my ears as I watched Margaret retreat to a corner of the room. She frantically whispered to Ethan, her eyes darting around as though searching for a way to regain control. Jonathan leaned toward me and whispered, she knows she's cornered. Now she's trying to figure out her next move. I nodded, feeling both nervous and exhilarated. Margaret's downfall had always seemed like a distant fantasy, but now it was unfolding right in front of me. Moments later, Ethan approached us, his expression tense. "Hey, Jonathan," he said, trying to sound casual. "Can we talk? Privately?" Jonathan smiled politely but firmly. "Anything you want to discuss, you can say in front of Lila." Ethan hesitated, glancing at Margaret, who stood frozen nearby. "Look, whatever you're talking about, financial discrepancies or whatever, it's clearly a misunderstanding. My mom, she would never do anything shady." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "You sound awfully confident, Ethan. Are you sure you're not involved in any of this?" The color drained from Ethan's face. "What? No. Of course not," he stammered. Before Jonathan could respond, Margaret marched over, her face flushed with anger. "That's enough," she snapped. "This is a wedding, not a courtroom. Whatever accusations you're making, save them for your office." Jonathan stood his ground, his voice calm but authoritative. "You're right, Margaret. This isn't the place to address these matters fully. But rest assured, they will be addressed, and soon." Margaret's jaw tightened as she grabbed Ethan's arm. "Come on, Ethan. Let's enjoy the evening," she said, dragging him away. I turned to Jonathan, my heart racing. "Do you think Ethan's involved?" I asked quietly. Jonathan sighed. "It's possible. But right now, Margaret is my priority. She's been at the center of too many suspicious activities to ignore." As the evening drew to a close, guests began to leave, but the tension lingered in the air. Jonathan and I were about to head out when a young woman approached us. "Excuse me," she said nervously, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I work at Green Enterprises and I overheard Margaret talking about you." Jonathan frowned. "What did she say?" The woman hesitated before continuing. "She's been bragging for months about how she's found ways to boost her income. She even said she had inside help from someone high up in the company. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after your speech tonight, I realized she might have meant Ethan." My stomach dropped. Could Ethan really be involved in Margaret's schemes? Jonathan thanked the woman and promised to follow up. As we walked to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the tip of the iceberg. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Jonathan assured me, his hand gently squeezing mine. I nodded, determined to see this through. Margaret had spent years belittling me and treating me like I didn't matter. Now, it was time for the truth to come out, and for her to face the consequences of her actions. The day after the wedding, Jonathan wasted no time. He called a meeting with his legal and financial teams to investigate Margaret's involvement in the company's financial irregularities. I sat in on the meeting, my heart racing as the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. It turned out Margaret had been siphoning funds from various accounts for over 2 years. She had disguised the transactions as legitimate business expenses, but Jonathan's team found clear evidence of her deception. What shocked me most was that Ethan's name came up as well. He had approved several of the fraudulent transactions, making it clear that he was complicit in Margaret's schemes. Jonathan decided to confront Margaret directly. He called her into his office under the guise of discussing her performance. I watched from a corner of the room, silently supporting him. Margaret entered, her usual confidence replaced with visible unease. She glanced at me but said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Margaret," Jonathan began, his tone calm but firm, "I've called you here to discuss some concerning matters. We've uncovered evidence of financial misconduct within the company, and your name is heavily tied to it." Margaret's face turned pale. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "This must be a mistake." Jonathan didn't flinch. "There's no mistake. We have records of unauthorized transactions and emails linking you to them. And that's not all. We've also found evidence of Ethan's involvement." Margaret's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely panicked. "Ethan? No, he's just following orders. He doesn't know anything about this." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "So, you're admitting you gave those orders?" Realizing her slip-up, Margaret quickly backtracked. "No, that's not what I meant. This is all a misunderstanding. I can explain." Jonathan raised a hand to silence her. "Save it for the lawyers, Margaret. You've been exploiting the company's resources for your own gain, and you'll be held accountable. Later that evening, Ethan showed up at our house unannounced. He looked disheveled, his usual polished appearance replaced with a frantic energy. "Lila, you got to talk to Jonathan," he pleaded, his voice shaking.
"He's going to ruin me."
I didn't know what Mom was doing. I just signed off on some documents she gave me. I swear. I crossed my arms, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You expect me to believe that? You've always been on her side, Ethan. You've never cared about anyone but yourself." Ethan's face fell. "Please, Lila. I'll lose everything. My job, my reputation. You should have thought about that before going along with her schemes," I said firmly. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, his expression cold. "Ethan, I suggest you leave. The investigation is already underway, and there's nothing you can say to change the outcome." Ethan looked between us, desperation in his eyes. "This is my life you're ruining." "No," Jonathan said sharply. "You and Margaret ruined your own lives. Now you'll face the consequences." Ethan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As the days went by, the investigation gained traction. Margaret was formally terminated from Green Enterprises, and legal charges were filed against her and Ethan. The news spread quickly, tarnishing their reputations and leaving them ostracized by the same social circles they once dominated. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of closure. Margaret's reign of control was over, and I no longer had to live in her shadow. Jonathan and I sat together one evening, watching the sunset from our backyard. "You've been amazing through all of this," he said, his arm around me. I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "I couldn't have done it without you." Margaret's downfall wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming my dignity and proving that I was stronger than she ever gave me credit for. And as I looked toward the future, I knew this was only the beginning of a life free from her influence. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. What would you have done in Lila's shoes? Let us know below. See you in the next video. Glowing star.